And now, okay. Good morning, everybody. We are starting our course, A Journey Through the Mishnah Torah. And I just learned some new names here and have quickly forgotten them because I'm good at that. I need to have a pen where I can write everything down. This is our first class looking in depth, more in depth than usual, into Maimonides and into his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah. And so before we get into talking about the Mishnah Torah, I want to talk a little bit about Maimonides' life. A lot of you, I knew your names and you're familiar, and we've been together because we've already been together for a year. We were together for a course before last course.
Yes.
And then last semester we took a, yes, exactly. And then there were the diaspora from Poland who came. But in addition to that, last semester, we went pretty in depth into the golden age of Spain that Emma just talked about. We talked about how it was neither a golden nor an age, but it was an incredibly short-lived, but very, very creatively, philosophically, theologically productive period of Judaism. And so we tried to understand who were the main personalities last year, but also why such a period of time came to be. What were the consequences? What were the historical consequences and circumstances that led to such a yet short-lived, yet extremely prolific and productive? So we're not going to get so much into that now, but you can't talk about Maimonides without talking a little bit about his life and where he came from, because he is a child. He is a product of this so-called golden age, even though, as you can see from the map, which I have here for the people on Zoom, this is just, the reason I wanted you to see this map is to see how much traveling and how much running and wandering his family had. And yet, when I say Maimonides or Rambam to you, I think that the first thing you think is, you think, what?
Right.
Spain, you think great, yes, you think, but you think Spain, that's exactly what you think. And yet by the time he was 20, he was out of Spain. Okay, even though we think of him as, where's Jackie? Jackie's not here. Jackie's our Spanish. Oh, okay.
She was going to get some money. She's nursing in the whole time.
Oh, okay, but she signed up for the class.
Well,
Yes,
if she can.
As she can. Okay, great. Well, Jackie, if you're listening, hopefully she'll listen to it afterwards. Jackie's our resident expert on Cordoba because she lived in Spain for quite a number of years. And we have some other people who have traveled around there. But you think of Maimonides, you think of Spain, you think of Cordoba, you think of Andalusia, you think of all the richness and glory of this golden age. And yet by the time he was 20, Maimonides was out of there. Rambam was out of there. Why do I call him Maimonides, or why do I call him Rambam? Just so we're all on the same page. Rambam is a Rashi Tevot. It's an abbreviation for Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and in Latin, it developed amongst Christians who also considered him to be the foremost Jewish philosopher, and they read his works. They started referring to him in the Latin age, which is Maimonides, Maimonides, the son of Maimon. And in fact, why is he always called Maimonides? It's because he referred to himself as Ben Maimon because his father and his lineage was quite esteemed. They were generations and generations of dayanim, of judges, and what we would call today chief rabbis of Cordoba and of Andalusia. And so he always wanted to reflect back on not just his father's lineage, but his further back, his lineage in general, when he talked about himself.
That's what they called him true anyway.
Yes,
I mean,
no, that's
Rashi. Exactly.
That's definitely true. But it was something that Rambam felt, Rambam was not someone who gave esteem for free. And so he did feel very proud of his lineage, and he had no problems with downgrading other lineages. And if there was something not worth repeating, he wouldn't repeat it. So that's how he refers to himself quite a bit. Yes, so if we just go back, let's look a little bit at his life. And so for the people who are in the class and for the people on the Zoom, we're just looking at his life. So He was born in Cordoba in Andalusia in, people say 1135, 1138. All of these dates, by the way, should have a C next to it, meaning circa, because nobody has exact dates. I always have him born 1135, because when I was in high school, one of my closest friends lived on, I can't even remember the name of her street, but her house number was 1135. And her mother, who liked to hold court on Shabbat afternoon, said, "It's Rambam's birthday. You'll never forget where we live." Well, lo and behold, the academic said that she should move houses because he was actually born in 1138. But this is one of those things that's in my head and will never leave. He was born 1135, and I know how to get to her house, But most academics say he was born 1138. Same with his date of death. Some of the academics have it earlier in the 1200s. We're going with 1220. So a lot of these dates can go back and forth. So he was born into a prominent rabbinic family that I already explained. What language did he speak? What language did he speak at home? Anybody who took the Golden Age class, tell me what language? Arabic, exactly, Arabic. That is why we think of him as a product of the Golden Age of Spain, is that even though by the time he comes into the world, we are still a few years away from the Reconquista being the time when the Christians retook control over many of these city-states. There wasn't like a unified until Ferdinand and Isabella, those, that great king and queen that finally kicked out the Jews in 1492. Until then, we had back and forth between Arab/Muslim control of various city-states and Christian control. And the Reconquista, which is going to happen a few years later, that is when the Christians took control of all of this area, of all of what we call Andalusia, and the Arabs call Al-Andalus. And that is all the southern area of Spain. Why is Rambam on the run then, if we're still a while away from the Christian takeover? Because while we talked about this last year, while we call it a golden age, and we talk about this conviviana, this convivial relationship between Arabs/Muslims and Jews, and this incredible ability for Jews to really reach to the heights of civil Muslim society in many respects, that goes back to what Bernard Lewis said. If we remember what Bernard Lewis said, we talked about it last semester. Life, and I don't have it right here, so I can't quote it exactly, but life for Jews under Muslim rule was never as bad as it was under Christian rule, but it never reached the heights that it did under Christian rule. So it was definitely positive. It was more positive. But what happens in Rambam's life? The Almohadis, who are a fanatical Islamist terrorist. Yes, exactly, an Islamic terrorist group, but a ruling terrorist group takes over a lot of this area. In response to the Crusades and everything that's going on, it has nothing to do with the Jews. They take over this area and they force everyone to either convert or to leave. And so he already finds himself fleeing in 1148 due to the Almohad persecution of Jews. And that begins, so as you see, he's 20 years old. That begins years and years of wandering until he finally settles. He ends up in Morocco, and he leaves Morocco, and he finally settles at the age of 30, or close to 30, he settles in Fustat, which is Old Cairo, okay? And there he ends up really having a huge impact on the Jewish community worldwide, but in Cairo, he very quickly becomes the leading voice of the Jewish community. But what's interesting is he always continues to refer to himself as an Andalusian, as a Jew from Sfarad. Okay, that's how he refers to himself. That's how he sees himself, and for good reason, because we're not talking about a 20-year-old from a typical 20-year-old who's running away. I was going to say like an Israeli 20-year-old, but by 20, most Israeli kids have done 2 years of army and are very, very mature and have seen a lot of the world. so too Maimonides, and he was also a genius. So by the time he was 20, he had already written in Arabic various philosophical, logical texts and books that were well known within beyond the Jewish community, well known and accepted within the scientific, philosophical, Islamic Arab community of Andalusia. So they too saw him as a product of Andalusia. And so he already showed himself to be a philosophical voice, a very strong voice by the time he's 20. And I just wanted to point out what are his major, he already had started giving some halachic responses, which we call responsa, and in Hebrew we say she'elot u'tshuvot. And if we want to questions and answers that rabbis give, and if we want to use the Rashi Tevot, the abbreviation, we call them shutim. We call them a shut or the shutim are responsa that rabbis write back and forth to each other. Now, last year in the Golden Age of Spain class, we saw that gradually in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century, you can find a lot of evidence for what direction a lot of these responsa take from the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza, which there was a shul not far from where Maimonides was, that had instead of throwing out holy papers and holy books or at that time holy manuscripts into a grave, a shemot grave, there was one very small shul that decided, to the fortune of all of us, to save every single piece of paper that had any Hebrew writing on it. That included, what did that include? It included Judeo-Arabic. What is Judeo-Arabic? It's Arabic that's written in Hebrew letters. So even though it's Arabic, because it had Hebrew letters, this shul made a decision they were not going to throw it out. Where did they put it? They didn't bury it. They put it in the attic. Okay. And this attic was discovered in the 19th century. I think Solomon Schechter was not the one to discover it. It was actually a pair of nuns who discovered it. And then Solomon Schechter was one of the first people to start doing research on it. And it continues to be research on this. It is not done yet because everything was saved, including letters from Maimonides and including your mother-in-law's shopping list. Everything was saved. If it had any Hebrew writing, if it just had Bet Hey on the corner, it was saved. And so you can imagine what an incredible treasure trove this is when it was discovered, and it continues to be something that's researched. In fact, you can research things. You can help input. There's a website for the Cairo Geniza where you can go in and they basically have gatekeeping. Like if you read Hebrew and you can manage to read some of the words, you can help them because there's just millions of little documents in this Geniza. But one of the things that has been discovered is that at a certain point, whereas Baghdad and what we would call Babylonia, the old Babylonia of the Talmud, then became Baghdad, we see that there's a slipping away of control where you have Jews who are living in the hinterland, like at the time Spain, right? These small Jewish communities that are found in Mediterranean European cities that in the 7th and 8th and 9th century, very, very small communities. They have no rabbinic leadership. So we see that they are addressing all their questions to the Jews in Egypt and the Jews in Baghdad. All of a sudden, we see a gradual shift so that by the time Maimonides is around, those letters are going in a different direction. They're going from Baghdad and Egypt over to Spain. So that's how we start to see that even in the halachic practical realm, Spain really starts to take real control. And we see that is one of the reasons why Maimonides is always referred to as an Andalusian. He always refers to himself as from Cordoba, even though he spends most of his adult life, all of his adult life is spent in Egypt. But that gives him credibility. That's his cachet. Because not only does it say that he's a leading halachic authority, what else does it say about him? It says that he's cultured. It says that he has a voice in things other than law, because that's the trademark of Spain at that time. Now, imagine he's on the run And then a devastating thing happens in his early 30s, is the death of his brother David. And his brother David was a younger brother of his, and David was a very, very good businessman. David supported the family. Because of David, Maimonides, Rambam, was able to, it was like his own personal kollel. He was able to spend all his days learning both philosophy and Jewish texts, and really become he clearly was a protege, and David supported him. David, on a business trip, his boat capsizes along with the family's fortune. Any proceeds and financial investments the family had goes down with the boat, and all of a sudden Maimonides not only finds himself being forced into a position of being the breadwinner, but also forced into a position of supporting his brother's family and his family of origin, and destitute. Absolutely destitute. After all these years of wandering and running around, he finally gets to Cairo, and he thinks that this is going to be it. He's going to have this world ahead of him, and it's not to be. And in fact, he doesn't spend, like a lot of Jewish thinkers. He's different than most Jewish thinkers, as we know, but a lot of Jewish thinkers don't refer back to they don't talk about their personal life. And he does. He does. He talks about going into a deep depression for a year, what we would consider, he calls it a depression, but in fact, it's the kind of signs that we are told to look for people who are post-trauma or depressed, which is, he says, for a year, I could not get out of bed. And the complete, the responsibility, the burden of all of a sudden being thrust into this position. And aside from the fact, he really loved his brother. He really loved his brother, and his brother was a student of his as well. And so he loved his brother, and not just losing his brother, but losing all means of financial support. So he goes into his bag of tools and realizes he's going to have to do something. Well, it turns out that while he was in Andalusia, before he had to run away to all these places, he also studied medicine. And so he continues to study medicine. And of course, he has the Arabic, and we learned in last year's class what happened with all these scientific treatises and on the natural sciences and medicine. They're all translated from the Greek, which had been the preceding treasure house of all great knowledge. All of that had been translated into Arabic. I cannot tell you whether Maimonides read or was able to understand Latin or Greek, but of course he was very able to understand Arabic and was able to write books on Arabic logic and Arabic language. So he pours himself into studying medicine, and eventually, as we all know, he became the sultan, one of the sultans in Egypt, his primary care physician. So he is able to successfully support his family as a doctor. At the same time, he also becomes the leader of the community, and we see from the Cairo Geniza that all questions from the Jewish world are sent to him. He becomes a center, we're not going to go into lots of details about this, from the Sephardic world, from the Arab-speaking Jewish world, not from the Aramaic/Hebrew/slang world of Ashkenazic Jews. They do not speak Arabic, and that's a whole other story. So you don't see the Tosafot sending questions to Maimonides. It's really from that Middle Eastern and Western Mediterranean part of the world. In the midst of all that, and this is really just to paint a picture of a very, very complicated, complex, not straightforward man who's on the run most of the time, finally settles down. And within the realm of that, look at when he completes his major Jewish works. His first major Jewish work, his first major work on Jewish thought, is his commentary on the Mishnah, which is written in Arabic. It's written in Judeo-Arabic. Okay, that's where he feels most comfortable. When does he write it? He starts writing it in 1158. And look at where he's at in 1158. For a little bit of time, he's in Morocco, and then again, he's on the run again from the Almohades. And then he even spends a little time in Israel, and then finally settles in Cairo. That's when he's in the midst of all of this, writing this major, major work, commentary on the Mishnah. And it's from the commentary on the Mishnah that he gets inspired, and he finally understands that he has to write the Mishnah Torah, which we're going to be focusing on this semester. The Mishnah Torah is written over a 10-year period, right after the commentary on the Mishnah. And how is it different? How is it different from the commentary on the Mishnah? We're going to get to it in a second, but we'll get to his last one, his last major work that everybody knows about is in 1190. He starts to write and completes the Guide for the Perplexed, which is a philosophical work aimed at traditional Jews who speak what? Who speak Arabic. Again, written in Arabic. Now, I ask you, why would his commentary on the Mishnah and why would his book on philosophy be written in Arabic? And why would the Mishnah Torah be written in Hebrew? In other words, he didn't just do it by happenstance. He made very intentional decisions about how he was going to compose his works, and he talks about it. So why would he choose to write his halakhic code? And I'm going to just stop sharing for now. Why would he choose to write his halakhic code in Hebrew and not in Arabic?
Aimed it at the whole Jewish world.
Say it loud.
He aimed it at the whole Jewish
He
world.
aimed it at the whole Jewish world. Exactly. Now, we don't know how much, for instance, before I even finish my sentence, we do not see who is, the greatest Jewish commentator to come before Maimonides is Rashi. Excellent. Rashi, 11th century. Okay. In all of Maimonides' work, we do not see a single reference to Rashi. Okay, which is really, really surprising. But I don't think he's silencing Rashi, because we don't even see references to the kind of interpretation, because Maimonides is well known for not quoting people. But we don't even see interpretive influences. And so we can venture to say that within the realm of commentary, within the realm of halakha, was a little bit different, but in Jewish law, within the realm of commentary, we don't see a lot of intersection between Sfarad and Ashkenaz, which is one of the reasons why you have these two communities kind of developing in parallel with each other and not a lot of intersection between them. So that's how you end up with Nusach Sfarad and Nusach Edora Mizrach and Nusach Temani. You end up with communities that have a specific type of way of praying, and you have Nusach Ashkenaz, and it's not very different, but it can be very irritating on Shabbat, right? Like, it doesn't seem like it's very different until you actually experience it. Exactly. And then, Sachakol, at the end of the day, how many differences are we talking about in the actual davening? It's different, but yes.
It's not just davening, it's principles of halakha.
It's exactly. All I have to say is kitniyot, right?
Yeah.
I'm changing.
Exactly. But those differences are practical differences. They're not such differences in belief, right? We don't have major differences in belief. We have cultural differences and practical differences, very different approaches, right? Yes, Emma.
If he's writing in Hebrew, can I just roll back on that?
Yes.
Is it not actually going to a more elite audience?
Oh, interesting. Okay, so Emma's question, and I'm going to start repeating questions because people have complained they can't hear it. So even though you articulated very well, but the question is, if Maimonides is writing in Hebrew, is he writing to a more elite audience? And that's a really good question. Anybody who is learned. So how many of you have learned Mishnah Torah before?
Done a bit with husband.
Okay, so have you learned it with the Hebrew?
I read the English.
No,
Yeah.
you got to read it in English to really, for us to understand it.
Yes.
The
So
reason
who has read it
I
in
did
some
it in
Hebrew?
because I was my husband's living translator. It's a very antiquated Hebrew, and he's looking for words to express himself.
In the Mishnah Torah.
Yeah, and he hasn't got the tools to the words to express it.
Okay, so that's
Hard to understand.
so both Rachel and remind me your name.
Jeffrey.
Both Rachel and Jeffrey are saying that it's a oh yeah, thank you. Oh my gosh, so I have to just say I have a daughter who just got released from the army, and for my Zichron classes, because there are 4 classes, she's going to be coming every week to manage this. So you're going to be my daughter for this class. You've just elected yourself as my technical support. So thank you. Okay.
I just lost the first name.
Oh, okay. So we'll get around. Okay. So Jeffrey and Rachel were just mentioning that the Hebrew to them felt kind of antiquated, and you are, what's your first name?
Jonathan.
Jonathan. So we just put Jonathan Gomberg, right?
Yeah.
Okay. and Jackie. Okay, great. Fantastic. This is so great. So now you have to sit in the exact same places. You will see, though, I'll be interested to hear what you have to say now that you've been exposed to more Hebrew and just from your time here. And a lot of people feel like of all the kind of Hebrew literature that you could read, especially compared to Rashi, for instance, Rashi, who's very, very terse, and often uses words that are not that commonplace. It feels like Maimonides was looking, and this is going back to Emma's question, it feels like Maimonides was looking for Mishnaic Hebrew. He was looking to formulate, he did not go back to biblical Hebrew because he wanted to make it accessible. And he even says, I'm using a Hebrew that will be the most accessible. And so I think that lahefach to what you were saying, there probably were groups of Jews who maybe didn't have Hebrew, but they really did. In other words, if you were a traditionally minded Jew, even in Sfarad, certainly in Ashkenaz,
Yeah, definitely the Ashkenazi were
that's
forming
all,
the Hebrew.
exactly. But he's deliberately chooses words that, like for instance, I would say it's probably on level to 5th grade Hebrew in Israel. So if you just have a little bit of education, you can manage Mishnah Torah. And so let's start looking at some of the let's dive into Mishnah Torah and talk about what Mishnah Torah is. And so for the people on the Zoom, I am going to share a document that I don't have up yet. So let's just get it up. Journey, here we go. Okay, and now let's go back to the Zoom. And we are going to share. Yes. Okay, so you should see an outline here on the Zoom called A Journey Through the Mishnah Torah. Okay, so we already talked about Maimonides' life. We already talked about his major works. And so let's step back for a second before we say what's special about the Mishnah Torah. Let's talk about what was happening culturally in Maimonides' time. And when I say culturally, I mean philosophically. Unlike a lot of Jews who are a product of the Golden Age, Maimonides, the one thing he was not was a poet. And remember last year, we talked a lot about Sephardic poetry. And that was sort of a mainstay, right? Junesh ben Lebrat, remember that? Remember him and Menachem ben Saruk. These were major Jewish poets who wrote in beautiful Arabic and also in Hebrew. Maimonides never ventured into poetry. That was the one cultural mainstay of Sephardic thought that he didn't go into. What did he go into? Science, philosophy, medicine, but all of those things were under one rubric. Philosophy was considered to be a part of the sciences. It was not, I don't know what we would call it today, we would call it humanities. But in that time, in that period of time, that was all part of what the Ashkenazi would call chutznik. It's like it's outside of the mainstream of what you're studying as a typical Jew in Ashkenaz. Jews in Ashkenaz did not study philosophy. They did not study logic. They did not study medicine. They didn't study natural sciences. They didn't study any of these things. Whereas for Maimonides' time, this was a mainstay plus poetry, plus songs, plus composing tefillot and things like that. So Maimonides really focused on the medicine, on the science. What were the main issues of his day? So the burning philosophical issues of his day. So let's go backwards for a second. We know that he was reading due to the fact that he was fluent in Arabic, as all Jews were fluent in Arabic in Muslim lands. They were all speaking and writing in Arabic. They had access. What did that give them access to? It gave them access to Aristotle, Plato, the great Greek philosophers. And you could say to me, why were medieval Muslims studying ancient languages and ancient science and ancient medicine? Because this was also the period of time known as the Golden Age of Islam. The Golden Age of Islam lasted a lot longer than the Golden Age of Spain for the Jews, because they were in control a lot of the time. And so they had the liberty and the freedom to keep learning and exposing themselves into intellectual ideas. And so somehow or other, it became very important to Muslim rulers to have access to a lot of this knowledge. And so we have the great Library of Alexandria. We have different caliphs who promoted libraries and promoted the translation of Greek works. And so we have a Renaissance going on where you have people who have never heard of Aristotle before, and centuries have gone by without anybody studying Aristotle, and all of a sudden it's the hottest thing you could do. Okay, so by virtue of these translations into Arabic, people like Maimonides had not just access to ancient wisdom, but also had access to the teachers of ancient wisdom, because now you have a proliferation of scholars and teachers who can teach philosophy. And so there was an Islamic school of thought that was very much in parallel with Maimonides, that was very prone to trying to rationalize religion with Aristotle, with an Aristotelian point of view of the world. Why not with Plato? Well, Plato, for whatever reason, which we will get into, got reinterpreted into something that became much more mystical and became much more Kabbalistic, or fed into what eventually was part of Sufism and Islamic mysticism and Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. So we'll continue to talk about some. We don't have to learn everything about this today, but we'll continue to talk about it. Now, if you all of a sudden have access to all of this philosophy, and you're a traditional Jew who is also trying to keep people on the path of traditional Judaism, imagine a Rabbi Sacks, for instance. So you've got Rabbi Sacks. And what does Rabbi Sacks have before him? Well, Rabbi Sacks actually did a PhD in philosophy. So he's very keyed into the burning issues of today. And so what Rabbi Sacks did is Rabbi Sacks said, I'm going to take my knowledge of Judaism, and I'm going to take my knowledge of philosophy, and I'm going to, rather than run away from the contradictions, I'm going to try to rationalize and explain the contradictions and see how they feed into each other, and sometimes say these two things are irreconcilable. Okay, so for Rabbi Sacks, what would that be? That would be like the meaning of life, the role of the individual, the role of diversity, some of the burning issues, the role of Israel, the state of Israel. How do you have a nationalist state in a world that's trying to subvert individuality? How do you have progressive ideas in within a tradition that's more meritocratic? I'm just trying to show an example of someone who is trying to take the burning issues of today and address it to the philosophy and the mainstream point of view outside of the religion. So Maimonides had that as well. Maimonides is sitting there as a major thinker, as the doctor to the Sultan. So he's obviously very aware of what's going on in the mainstream world outside of the Jewish community. And he sees what's going on philosophically and sees what's going on in the Jewish community and says, I think I can help. I think I can bridge some of these ideas. And what were the burning issues of his day, the burning philosophical issues of his day? And bear in mind, these are not necessarily going to be the same burning issues for our day. Okay, so we talk about it and we say, for instance, ex nihilo, the idea that the world was created from nothing into something. That was a burning issue of his day. We say in Hebrew, yesh ma'ayin, okay? That nothing existed before the first words of Breshit. Before God called the world into being, the world didn't exist. It came from, and then you ask, but what did it come from? So it's this very complicated concept. It comes from nothing. Now, today, that's not such a burning issue, because for Jews at that time, they were over-interpreting Breshit. You know, for us, we see Breshit, we often read Breshit as more of a metaphor. There are a lot of concepts that can't be described. And so Breshit is not trying to say it was actual 7 days of creation. And this, today, people will say, well, I will give you an example. What is the burning issue of today versus ex nihilo? Evolution, right? Or Big Bang Theory, that can be a burning issue of today. How do you say that before Big Bang, there was another explosion and a different explosion and dinosaurs? I remember when I was going to school, Jewish day school in the 80s, this was like nonstop. We were constantly, hearing that dinosaurs didn't exist and dinosaurs did exist and now they don't exist and then they did exist. And then after a while, I think that today, if you go into a Jewish day school, they would say, don't worry about it. There's a lot of stuff we don't know, and this isn't an issue. This is no longer an issue. But in his time, the idea that the world, Aristotle said that the world at some point came into being, which throws a big question to Jewish thinkers, which is, what about God? If God is perfect, if God is truth, if God is all-knowing and omnipresent and omnipotent. And by the way, all those words I just said would be verboten, would be forbidden by Maimonides, because Maimonides said there's no way to describe God. You can't even use positive words. You can only use negative words to describe God, because God is not a concept that you can understand. And so for medieval people, that's already a very complex idea to say, I cannot describe God, but it fits very well with Arabs. It fits very well with Muslims, doesn't fit so well with Christians, right? Because they do have a God that they can describe very well. And so these are the kinds of things that Maimonides is grappling with. The other big thing that Maimonides is grappling with is the idea of nature versus man. When I say man, I mean humankind, but it just sounds better to say man. I don't know why, because we say to keep saying humankind instead of man. So I'll say man in place of all humans. To Maimonides and to the philosophers of his time, there's a perfection in nature. Nature is perfect, okay? There's nothing imperfect about nature, whereas everything that is man-made is by definition imperfect. One day, this table's not going to be here. Sorry to say, one day we're not going to be here, right? From the moment we're born, there's that famous line that Winston Churchill said to, was it King Albert, the one who was who died of cancer?
George.
King George, but his name was Albert.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so King George comes to Winston Churchill and says, Winston, I have to tell you, I'm in the process of dying. And Winston said to him, Bertie, we're all in the process of dying. And that's the nature of humankind. From the moment we're born, it's a journey to the end. Whereas nature, in the medieval philosophical sense, is eternal. It's perfect. It's unending. It's not man-made. But how do you say that God, who is fully true and fully perfect, how can you say that God creates something that will no longer be? And so that reconciling of the corporeality of man, meaning the mortality, meaning the fact that man degrades over time, people degrade over time. No matter what Peter Attia says about longevity and health span, he even admits there's, you just want to make life better. You're not going to make life eternal. So how do you reconcile that with perfection, with God? And then the main thing, this is the main area that Maimonides is grappling with, is the consequence of that, which is truth versus revelation/reason, okay? And miracles, by the way. So if you have nature and you have nature representing God and thereby being a reflection of truth, then what do you do about prophets? How can something that is perfect and eternal communicate with something that is degrading, something that is imperfect, something that's going to go away? How do you bridge that? How do you explain that interaction, that divine interaction? And how do you explain the fact that you have philosophers that are studying and striving for truth, divine truth? How do they compare with someone like Moshe or someone like Abraham, who are prophets, who are where truth is being communicated to them through revelation? How come they don't go through the same process as the philosopher? How come the prophet doesn't have 10 years of courses on logic, and then 10 years of courses on philosophy, and then 10 years of courses on science, and then somehow is able to get to this point of divine intellect. And then you have Abraham, who's, a young man who suddenly has God speaking to him. How do you reconcile those things? Okay. And then I would add here, which I didn't add, which is miracles. That's a big thing for Maimonides, is miracles. How, if the Red Sea is a reflection of nature, which is a reflection of God, which is a reflection of perfection, how do you have it splitting? How do you have a momentary blip in the natural world? Isn't that contrary to eternity? Isn't that contrary to divine intelligence? And so I can look at all your faces and you're all coming up with answers. You don't have to, because like I said, these aren't the burning issues for our day. These are burning issues for medieval Jews who are grappling with this. And Maimonides sets out to understand this and try to give some understanding for how we can reconcile what in his day was traditional Judaism with these heavy, heavy concepts. And so if I asked you, where does he set out to understand, where does he set out to what book does he use? What platform? Guide of the Perplexed, right? You would say, of course, Guide of the Perplexed is Maimonides's masterpiece. And it's where he addresses very forcefully and sometimes between the lines all of these issues. And I would tell you, that's not the only place he does it. He does it in every single one of his works, and especially in the Mishnah Torah. And that's what we're going to be exploring this semester. And so while these are burning issues that are obviously at the forefront of the Guide of the Perplexed, we're going to see that they're embedded in his understanding of halakha. And then you can ask, what does philosophy have to do with halakha? And that's part of what makes Mishnah Torah so incredibly revolutionary, and what makes this class revolutionary. Because when people set out to study Mishnah Torah nowadays, they don't look for the philosophy, and you can lose it. You can miss it. You can totally miss it. And what we're going to be doing in this semester is looking for it. Like if you're looking for truffles, like you can walk in a field and you'll never find them, right? You have to have the right nose or the right snout to find them. So you could take a trek, you could take a tiul, and you could be in southern France and never know that there are truffles unless you're looking for them. And we're looking for the truffles. We're looking for those items that could seem insignificant, but are very significant. Okay, so now what's special about Mishnah Torah? And if I could get my hands on my book, I would be able to show you the book. I'm a student. Why should you be studying with me? You don't have to, by the way, it's a free country. But what gives me the chutzpah to think that I could teach anything about Mishnah Torah? Because I don't have that much chutzpah. I probably do, but part of it comes from the fact that I was a student of Isidore Tversky, Professor Yitzchak Tversky from Harvard. And I was in a PhD program with him. He was my advisor, but he passed away so I finished my master's, and hopefully will one day finish my PhD. But his entire life's work was dedicated to understanding Rambam, and his magnum opus was his introduction to the Code of Maimonides, where he bucked the academic mainstream, which looked at the Guide of the Perplexed as Maimonides's masterpiece, magnum opus, and his place where he addressed all of the burning issues of his day. And Tversky said, no, it was actually Mishnah Torah. That's where that Maimonides considered Mishnah Torah, and this is the theme of the class. Maimonides considered Mishnah Torah to be his magnum opus. He says it explicitly and he repeats it, and people try not to listen to it, but that is how he saw it. And the reason why academics and a lot of people don't always feel so comfortable with that analysis is because obviously the Guide of the Perplexed is his great philosophical work. And at the end of the day, what is Mishnah Torah? It's a code of law. which
Prac-
seems like what?
It's practical.
It's practical, exactly, which seems like a very boring and unusual place to embed. We'll try next time, Ronnie, to be more on time. I remember that you have to go.
About him. Just-
Uh, it's very, very practical. And so why would you ever find philosophy there? And frankly, it's boring for academics to just read halakha and try to find philosophy. So it just seemed like an unnatural place to do it. But Twersky argued forcefully, and I think correctly, and I think he changed the shape of academic perspectives on Maimonides. And in fact, in this class, we will be basing our class on two analyses. One is Isidore Twersky's, and if I had the book, I would show it to you because it's a great book. It's very, very dense, but we'll be using that as a template for understanding Maimonides. And the second book is by Moshe Halbertal, which was published, I think, about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, called The Life of Maimonides, The Life and Work of Maimonides. So we'll be using both their perspectives in looking at Maimonides. Twersky outlines 5 ways in which the Mishnah Torah was completely revolutionary. And we'll try to put it into more simple terms. So first of all, it's a halakhic code, and that didn't really exist before. What was an example of a halakhic code before Maimonides was the Rif, right? The Rif was Rabbi Alfasi, I forgot his first name, Rabbi Yehuda Alfasi, who came from that Baghdad area. I think he was 9th century or 10th century. Basically, what the Rif does is the Rif goes through all of Mishnah and all of Talmud, and he goes in the same order as the Mishnah and the Talmud, and he codifies it. He just strips out the law, which is a great way to learn Talmud, right? Because it just goes tachlis. What do we need to know from this? That is the only code that exists before the Mishnah Torah. What is the most famous code of halakha? The Shulchan Aruch, okay, by Rabbi Yosef Karo from the 16th century, very influenced. And if we want to say one important thing about the Mishnah Torah, it's that it had a direct influence on the Shulchan Aruch, and that comes up more and more. And I'm not a student of the Shulchan Aruch, so I can't tell you how, but I've been told that this is true. Unlike the Shulchan Aruch, unlike the Rif, who came before him, and the Shulchan Aruch who came after him, Maimonides comes up with an entirely new classification of law. He does not, interestingly enough, he does not go through halakha in the order of the Mishnah. He does not start with Moed and then go to Nashim and then he does not go in the order of the books that you see there. He creates his own order, okay? And that's already, people's heads are, does not compute, right? So already from the form, he's already revolutionary. Then there comes the scope, okay? He is, the Mishnah Torah goes through every single aspect of anything that you will find in the Talmud. The scope is incredibly vast and incredibly commensurate with the Talmud, except for where he deliberately keeps something out. And because the scope is so vast, you understand that when he keeps something out, he's doing it for a reason. It's not because he made an error. He's doing it for a reason. And that's part of the fun in analyzing it. Classification. Okay, do you know what one of the first books of Mishnah Torah is called? It's called Hilchot Tshuva, the laws of Tshuva, the laws of repentance. That already should have light bulbs going on off in your head. Why? There is no book of Tshuva in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, or in any rabbinic writings. And all of a sudden, at the outset of the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides introduces the laws of Tshuva, the laws of repentance. And you wonder, what does Tshuva have to do with law? In fact, what's interesting, just to go down that line for a second, Maimonides wrote a different book called Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of Commandments, where he outlines what the 613 commandments are. Guess what? He doesn't include Tshuva. He doesn't include repentance. He includes confession, okay, which is very different. It's not the same. Tshuva is about the process. Confession, the vidui, is the last part of the process. And yet he has a whole book in his halachic code about tshuva, which he didn't even consider to be a commandment. And so already from the point of view of classification, you have to scratch your head and say, what is he doing? What is he trying to tell us? Because he's trying to tell us something in every single one of the laws that he puts forward. Second, language and style. I'm not second, fourth. Like, this is how I am at the gym, you know, like they say do 10 and I'm like, okay, 1, 2, 8. And they always catch me on it. So language and style. He sets out from the very beginning that he's going to write this in accessible Hebrew. And he says in letters that he published we find in the Geniza from much later, that he specifically says to other people who say, like Emma, you were saying, what if you can't read Hebrew? He had students who said, could you please translate this into Arabic? Because we know you can. And he says, no, I deliberately wrote it into Hebrew because I was looking for a particular style that would be accessible by any Jew at any time. And so like Rabbi Sachs, like the late Rabbi Sachs, who went and created a whole library of YouTube videos so that years after he passed away, we can still learn the Parsha with Rabbi Sachs on YouTube and on social media and in written form. Just like Rabbi Sachs before him, Maimonides was already thinking about his audience today. He was already thinking, 1,000 years from now, I want people to be able to sit in the Tanya and read my work. And if I write it in Arabic, they're not going to be able to read it. Now you guys are saying, okay, but I still need the English. Yeah, but you have access to the Hebrew in a way that you wouldn't have in Aramaic or in Arabic. And that is what he was already thinking about. And he says it explicitly. He says, basically, I want this to last. Okay, this is my magnum opus. I want it to last. And finally, law and philosophy. And this is the point of the class. The idea that within halakha, within law, you can talk about philosophy, you can talk about theology. And that was something that had never been addressed before. I want to, I think this is a good place to stop, but I will start with the first source from our sheet. And on the Zoom, I will just scroll down. The first source from the sheet is the first, you know, that there was a style at the time, and it's still a style today, that when you start a book, you start it with an introduction. And the first, if it's a Sefer Kodesh, if it's a holy book, if it's a book about a holy subject, you start it with a pasuk. And I think it's very interesting. The first line of the Mishnah Torah is a pasuk that says, "Az lo evosh b'habiti el kol mitzvotecha." I will not be ashamed when I regard all your commandments. What does that mean? What does that mean? I mean, I'm open to suggestions, but when I read this as Maimonides knowing that he was about to enter into a very controversial topic. And in fact, it was a controversial topic. It was
burned for many years.
Exactly. And we're going to talk about that too. He knew that his books were going to be controversial. He knew that this code of law was going to be controversial. Why was it so controversial? I just listed 5 reasons why it was controversial. But the main reason for the people of his time was that there are no footnotes in the Mishnah Torah. There are no debates. Will you be shocked to know there's no machloket? There's no debate in the Mishnah Torah. He just tells you this is how it's done.
Here's why you know.
Exactly. And so he starts off by knowing people are going to be really pissed off by this, and I'm not embarrassed. I'm not ashamed. I stand by my work. And he already sets out the introduction to the Mishnah Torah by saying, I'm confident of where I stand. Of course, he also calls it Mishnah Torah, which can mean lots of things. It can mean addition to Torah. It can mean supplanting Mishnah, and it can be as controversial as you want it to be. So I think this is a good place to end. This is basically the introduction. Next week, we will just use this last little source, which I will put on the next sheet. So we can just, the introduction to the Mishnah Torah, which I call the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, is quite long. And I just summarized it in one paragraph from the Mishnah Torah. So we'll learn that and we'll step into examples from the Mishnah Torah that reflect some of the things that we talked about. So thank you for joining. And in terms